A new book called Decisions About Decisions, how we decide what information to acquire. For an individual, for a business, for a government, ignorance can be bliss. With respect to suffering, it might be folly to be wise. Governments all over the world are confronted with the question what to disclose and what not to disclose. 27% of people want to know the year of their death. If people want to know, how much do they want to know? If people don't want to know, how much do they want not to know? Understanding people's interest in or aversion to information can have policy relevance.
Who and how information should be provided to in terms of administration or corporate governance. We are trying to feed kids nationalism, religion, as well as many other things, and then the modern subjects. Does it affect their cognitive capability over a lifetime or not?
I would really want to give a warm welcome to Professor Casper Sunstein, who today would be talking about his new book, which is titled Decisions About Decisions. We are very honored to have you, sir. And we are very fortunate that Cass Sunstein has joined us for the third time in the PIDE webinar. And so we have really learned a lot from your previous two webinars, and that has actually materialized into PIDE operationalizing certain research topics on your very illuminating pieces of work. And we really look forward to picking up some few interesting topics and operationalizing them again into some research. So over to you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be able to speak with you again. And I feel like we are friends and family members now, given the fact that this is my third. And I'd like to applaud you really for your work on sludge and sludge audits. That it is extraordinary and an inspiration to many. All over the world, there are efforts to reduce administrative burdens and sludge, and you can't improve what you don't measure, or at least it's very hard to do that. And you've taken inspiring steps really toward measurement and reduction. And all over the world, nations are trying to reduce sludge and administrative burdens to make processes work better. And it is wonderful, really extraordinary to see the work that you've done. All of us are learning from what you've done. I'll turn now to the current topic, which is a new book called Decisions About Decisions. I like to think of this as my least bad book. It's a little much to say that one's book is one's best. I prefer to say this is my least bad book. I'm alert to the flaws in all of my writing, but this is the one I dislike least. What I like about it, I'll be a little candid, is that the question of how one makes decisions about decisions is among the most fundamental in human life. It works for individuals in our own personal lives. We might be thinking about a medical issue and we make decisions, but we also might decide that we will follow our doctor. That is a decision about a decision. We might decide, if we are a business, that confronted with a challenge, we will follow a rule. That is, we will never invest more than a certain amount of money in a new project, or we will never hire people who have who don't have certain qualifications, or we will always do the following if a customer has a complaint. In government, we might think that under serious challenges, let's say climate change might be one, we will take small steps. We will do something in 2023, something in 2024, something in 2025, and we will make sure that the steps we take are reversible. That's because the problem any nation faces with respect to climate change might be itself changing over time. So our decision about our decision might be small steps. So I've given an example of a decision about a decision, which involves delegation to someone else, like a doctor, that involves adoption of a rule, such as we will never or we will always, or a small step. Those are simply three examples of decisions about decisions. And whether we rely on a small step, whether we flip a coin, whether we adopt a rule, or we will delegate, ought to depend on the burdens imposed by one or another step and the likelihood that we would make serious mistakes. The problem with a rule is that it might be too ambitious. It might not suit the complexity of life. The problem with a small step might be that we have a serious challenge that we need to address in an ambitious way today. And much of the book is struggling with the question, what for an individual, for a business, for a government, for those involved in law, is the appropriate decision about decisions. What I'm going to present to you right now is, I confess, the part of the book that I most enjoyed writing and that I most enjoy thinking about, which is how we decide what information to acquire. The information might be information that bears on our health. It might be information that bears on our safety. It might be information that bears on our community. It might be information that bears on our friends. And what I'm going to be exploring with your kind indulgence is how different people make different decisions about what information they want to obtain. What kind of decision about decisions do they make with respect to knowledge? And I want to get at this by an unlikely route. It's a poem. It's one of the great poems in my language, which you may have noticed is English. Thank you for tolerating that. And the poem is about observing young men playing a sport. The poet is amazed by the youth and vigor of the athletes playing football, I think it was, on a field. And then he starts to think about their future, the young men's future. And what the poet writes is, to each his sufferings. All are men, condemned alike to groan, the tender for another's pain, the unfeeling for his own. Yet, why should they know their fate, since sorrow never comes too late, and happiness too swiftly flies? Thought would destroy their paradise. No more, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. That poem is a plea for the value of not knowing. Ignorance can be bliss with respect to suffering. It might be folly to be wise. Take that idea that ignorance is bliss as resonant for our species. Often we don't want to know, but take as the alternative the view that knowledge is power. So what I'm going to be exploring is the idea that ignorance is bliss on the one hand, and that knowledge is power on the other. I received a lesson on the depth of this issue when I was in the White House under President Obama. We worked on a regulation designed to give people information about the calories in their food. And the idea would be you go to a restaurant and you see the calories in your meal. And you can make a choice that is healthier because it has fewer calories. There was a question whether to apply this rule to movie theaters. So if you go to the movie theater, should the food there have labels also about calories? I was part of the team that wanted that to be the choice. I thought if people are going to the movie theater, they deserve to have information also. And there was a contest within the White House. Ultimately, the decision was made, yes, we will require disclosure of calories in the movie theater. My best friend, who is my wife, was the first person I wrote to saying that we were going to require disclosure of calorie labels in movie theaters. And her answer on email consisted of 3 words. It is Cass ruined popcorn. Cass ruined popcorn. That I thought was a profound 3-word email. What she was saying was when people go to the movie theater, they want to enjoy the movie. They don't want to think I am endangering my health as I eat popcorn. The idea of ruining popcorn will be central to the remarks I'll be giving you. I want to make a personal notation, since we're friends, about the importance of the concept of ruining popcorn. And the personal notation involves my father. Several decades ago, my father started to stumble on the tennis court. He was a very good tennis player, and he started to have difficulty retaining his balance. He went to the hospital with my mother and me. He had a series of tests, and my mother came to the hospital room where we were eating lunch after speaking to the doctor and said, "I have wonderful news. The test showed you have nothing wrong with you. You'll have further tests, but we have very good news. You are healthy." We had a celebration in the hospital room. I remember it as if it were yesterday, after which my mother took me down to the parking lot to drive me back to law school. I was a law student. And as soon as we got in the car, her face changed. It was as if she had been an actor or an actress, and she went from celebratory and joyful to despair. It's the only time I've seen despair on a human face. And she said to me, "Your father is very sick. He has a brain tumor. He's going to die within a year, but I'm not going to tell him, and neither are you." She made a judgment. It was a decision about a decision, that she was not going to give him that horrible news. She thought she did not want to ruin his popcorn. She wanted him to have as many months as possible of normal, hopeful life, and to have the despair that she felt in his head only when he couldn't avoid it. It worked. He had 6 to 8 good months before he started to get very sick. Governments all over the world are confronted with the question what to disclose and what not to disclose, what to require disclosure of, and what not to require disclosure of. Governments all over the world are also thinking, when will disclosure of information be a blessing for people, and when will it be a curse? That was an issue I confronted in the Obama administration frequently, and it was an issue that we found very challenging. Do you disclose risks that are very small? Do you mandate disclosure of that? Maybe people will ignore it. Maybe people will be angry. Maybe they'll be frightened. Maybe you will ruin the equivalent of their popcorn. Okay, fascinated by this problem, I have over the last years engaged in a research program in, I believe, 17 nations, not Pakistan, but 17 nations, just asking people what they want to know. This was a reckless research program in the sense that I did not have a hypothesis in advance. I did not say I want to test 3 hypotheses and identify them. I simply asked a battery of questions to people in multiple nations, asking them what they wanted to know. And the reason I did this is simple. I wanted to know. The research program, which is continuing, is asking people an assortment of questions. Do you want to know this? It turns out that in many nations, about 43% of people want to know the calories in their food. 43%. 57% do not. And what I'm going to tell you now is some highlights from the research results that I've been engaged in trying to obtain. About 27% of people want to know the year of their death. That is the question that receives the highest percentage of people saying, please do not tell me. I have made a decision about that decision. I don't want to know. That's interesting, isn't it? People also don't want to know the year of death of their wife or husband. But 47% of people want to know whether they are going to get Alzheimer's disease, a kind of dementia. That's interesting. 53%, a majority, they don't want to know. About 58% of people want to know if they're going to get cancer. A substantial minority, 42%, say, please don't ruin my popcorn. Only 42% of people, and I hope you will find this amusing, Only 42% of people in one study, this is in the United States, want to know what their friends and family really think of them. A majority don't want to know what their friends and family really think of them. Maybe they will get bad news. Interestingly, surprisingly, this was a somewhat frivolous question. I asked people whether they want to know whether the person for whom they have romantic feelings returns those feelings. So suppose you have romantic feelings for someone. Do you want to know if the person feels the same way about you? Only 58% of people wanted to know. 42% did not want to know. I also asked this question of students at a large university. Almost 100% wanted to know. What is the difference between the general population and students? Is that the students are more optimistic. They think they'll get an answer which will please them. Is that the students think that they are not married, so they're not worried about the answer. Is it that people don't want to get an answer that might make their life a little more complicated or terrible? Only 42% of people want to know how much warmer the planet will be in 2100. That's stunning, isn't it? In an American population, 67% of people want to know the safety ratings for their tires. That's about the highest percentage I got on questions that involve consumer choice. 65% of people want to know the side effects of pain relievers. Typically, on questions about disclosure of information that bears on consumer choice, the percentage is over 50%, but it is not as high as 70%. That's very rare. I hope you can see that this is an early stage of a research program. While I have a lot of data, the data is limited to 17 nations, and the data is a limited number of questions. There are numerous questions involving policy and law on which we have no data. I also want to add that thus far, it looks like humanity is pretty much the same across diverse nations. In poor nations and rich nations, in nations that have different cultures and different political systems, I'm basically getting the same kinds of answers, the same percentages of answers. There's no nation yet in which half of people want to know when they're going to die. There's no nation yet in which 80% of people want to know if they're going to get Alzheimer's. There's no nation in which 15% of people want to know the safety ratings for their tires. There's a lot of uniformity across persons. With research colleagues, I've tried very hard to learn whether there are demographic differences, whether men are different from women, whether young people are different from older people, whether people with different religious traditions are different from people with other religious traditions. And basically, our general answer is we're not picking up much in the way of difference. Okay, I hope you're wondering now, if people want to know, how much do they want to know? If people don't want to know, how much do they want not to know? There's a difference, by the way, an important difference between not wanting to know and wanting not to know. I don't want to know how many bald people there are in Paris. I'm just not interested in that. But I don't want not to know how many bald people there are in Paris. That is, I don't especially dislike the idea of learning that. It's just I'm not interested. We're trying to measure also when people don't want information, how much do they not want it? And the way we are trying to measure that is by asking people, if you want information, how much would you pay for it? And if you don't want information, how much would you pay not to get it? Our results, thus so far, suggest that when people want information, they're willing to pay some significant money, but not a lot, to receive it. If people don't want to receive information, they're willing to pay some money, but it's very small not to receive it. So far, it looks like people who want information, for example, calorie labels, they'll pay money, not a lot, but real money to receive that information. And when people don't want to receive information, say calorie labels, they'll say, I'll pay you a tiny bit not to tell me. Please don't tell me, but I don't really mind terribly if you tell me. I'll pay you a little bit. Okay, I described this as a reckless research project. And it's reckless because, as noted, there wasn't a hypothesis I meant to test. So I've accumulated an extremely small fraction of what it would be good to know about this fundamental topic, but it is a massive amount of data. Given the massive data, admittedly an extremely small percentage of what we should want to know, the question is what explains it? I've worked more recently with colleagues to try to understand that. And we now have a hypothesis, which we've tested, and the hypothesis appears to be true. And I'm now going to give you the hypothesis, which has been retrofitted onto the data. That's not best practice, but which has also been tested prospectively with respect to information and which seems to be working. Okay, here's the hypothesis that people balance three factors when deciding whether they want information. Each of us does this, sometimes very rapidly and not consciously. And I'm extremely curious to know whether people in Pakistan are exactly the same as people in, let's say, Spain and Germany and Mexico and Italy, or whether people in Mexico, say, are very different from people in other nations, or whether there are domains in which people in Pakistan are keenly interested in receiving information and people in other nations not so much. That would be very interesting to know, but here's the theory. First, people care a great deal about whether information is useful. You might think that knowing when I'm going to die is not going to tell me anything I can do anything about. It's useless information. It's just like knowing whether there's life on Mars. That's not important to my life. Some information, the safety ratings of tires, is extremely useful to people. They want tires that are safe. The side effects of medicines are very useful to those who are vulnerable to those side effects. Some information has a great deal of instrumental value. If you can protect yourself against risk or get economic opportunity, you might really be keen to receive that information. Some information has no instrumental value and you don't care. Some information has negative instrumental value. At Harvard recently, I was in my hallway near my office on the day that the student course evaluations came out. And I said to a colleague, our evaluations came out. We can see how we did. Isn't that exciting? And he looked at me without agreement. And he said, no, that's terrible. And I said, what do you mean? It's good information. We can see how we performed as teachers. And my colleague said, I never read them. I haven't read them in 20 years. And I said, why not? He said, if I read them, I'm just going to get angry at my students because the evaluations aren't as good as I hoped, and then I won't teach as well. So the information has negative instrumental value. If you learn the year that you're going to die, it might have adverse effects on what you do in the years of life. If you learn when that you're going to get Alzheimer's, that might have an assortment of negative effects on how you perform. So people are making a rapid judgment about whether the information is A, useful, B, not useful, C, negative in terms of its instrumental effect. That has policy relevance. Government can play up or play down the usefulness of information. It can credibly indicate to people this is information you really could benefit from learning. And if it can do that, it can make information disclosure more rather than less effective. That's the first part. The second part is people in our data are extremely conscious about how the information is going to make them feel. Will it make them feel sad, happy, secure, at risk? Will it make them feel scared? Will it make them feel calm? That factor, the emotional impact of receiving information, is extremely important. And those of us who have studied economics and think about social science generally, I think have undervalued the importance of the emotional impact of information on people's well-being and their desire to receive information. When people say they don't want to know whether they're going to get cancer or Alzheimer's or the year of their death, it's because they think that's sad or frightening to hear. When people don't want to know the calories in their meals, it's because that'll just make them enjoy their meals less. It will ruin popcorn. Think, if you would, of the idea of ruining popcorn as a metaphor for how people think broadly about receiving information. Much of our data is best explained by the fact that some percentage of the population is not thinking, is this information useful, but are thinking, how will the information make me feel? There's diversity in any population with respect to how much weight people give to one or another of these variables. Any of us, I think, might think right now, do I tend to weigh the emotional impact, or do I tend to weigh the instrumental value of the information? I can tell you that my wife is an information seeker. She thinks of the usefulness of information. I give more weight to the emotional impact. I tend to think, probably more than I should, how is the information going to make me feel? Instrumental value, emotional impact, and the third value, let's call it cognitive value, where there's some information that people want to receive, not because it's useful and not because it will make them happy or sad, but because it will satisfy something like their curiosity. When people want to know, for example, whether the planet's going to get much warmer in 2100, it might not be because that information is going to please them or going to be useful, but because they are really curious. And people of different kinds give different weight to that third value. So the theory is that people's decision about the decision whether to acquire information is sometimes a very rapid and sometimes a quite reflective judgment about the instrumental value, the emotional impact, and about the cognitive value of the information. Okay, this theory we've tested now in various contexts, and it seems to be pretty close to human reality, that people make assessments of these values, and the high numbers we receive for tire safety ratings and the low numbers we receive for the year of your partner's death are best explained by reference to these variables, and the heterogeneity in the data, the fact that different people make different judgments, is also similarly explained. I think we have to note that thus far my account of people's decision about whether to receive information is a fully rational account by which people are making rational assessments about what they want to receive. If you have children or parents or friends, and I hope everyone on this call has at least two of those, children, parents, friends. If you do, I hope you're thinking at this point that people's judgments about whether to obtain information are not completely rational, that people's assessments are human rather than like an algorithm. And that's fair. Here are two things that really matter with respect to imperfect rationality and information acquisition. The first is present bias, by which people are weighting, that is, giving weight to, today and tomorrow, and not giving a lot of weight to the long term. If that's so, then information that will affect 2023, people will care greatly about, but information that will affect 2033 might be completely uninteresting. And we're picking that up in some of our data. If people show present bias, then they will be insufficiently interested in information that affects their long-term well-being And this might be true for people in their 20s. It might be true for people in their 40s. It might be true for people in their 60s. And it creates a problem for economic and health opportunity, educational opportunity as well, where acquisition of information with long-term benefits might be insufficient, given its instrumental importance. It's also the case that information that makes people sad, like they are at risk of some disease, might be something people won't want to get or risk getting, even though receiving that information can be extremely beneficial in the long term. If you learn that you have some health condition that is very not fun to learn about, you might also learn there are things you can do to manage it, which can make its adverse effect lower. And if people are present biased, they won't receive information. They won't seek it. And if they get it, they won't pay attention to it. It's also the case that people tend to be unrealistically optimistic. About 80% of most populations are unrealistically optimistic. Most people think they are less likely to get diseases than the average person, less likely to suffer than the average person. Most people think their sense of humor is better than that of the average person. I think that's funny, but then I am unrealistically optimistic like most of the rest of us. If people are unrealistically optimistic, they might also fail to seek information, thinking they can't benefit from it, even though it's really important to have. Unrealistic optimism can lead to underestimation of the value of receiving information. We know that understanding people's interest in or aversion to information can have policy relevance. If we know that people balance these three factors, and we also know that unrealistic optimism and present bias can lead to insufficient information seeking, we might know that a government seeking to provide information or a company seeking to provide information can inadvertently fail by failing to give people clarity that the information is useful, and by failing to accentuate that the information won't make them miserable. It will actually make them better off. Disclosure of information, and I think we saw this some in the COVID pandemic, that makes people feel despair or hopeless or frightened, might lead people to say, I don't believe it, and I'm not going to pay attention to it. So people's reluctance to accept information is often connected with the factors of, is it useful and how does it make me feel? And if governments aren't attentive to that, they will not succeed as much as they would like to in informing citizens. My wife, I should say, who runs USAID, was in Pakistan not long ago. She was there in connection with the horrible flooding, for which my heart goes out to you all to face that. And she was in over parts of Pakistan and seeing the waters there. Risks associated with flooding are things that we can manage to some extent. And to do that, we need information. And for the information to work, it needs to be thought to be useful and thought to be not a source of terror, but instead of a sense of possibility. And all over the world, nations that face extreme heat, flooding, drought, and wildfire, something we're grappling with here, need to use information as the first line of defense. And we need to know fundamentally what people want to know. And if they don't want to know it, why not? In order to make information disclosure effective. Many nations are concerned, I think now more than ever, about mental health. Anxiety and depression might be associated with insufficient or excessive information seeking. We hypothesize that people suffering from depression don't want to receive information, and not getting information can aggravate depression. We also hypothesize that certain forms of anxiety are associated with obsessive and excessive information acquisition that can compound anxiety. These are unconfirmed hypotheses, though there's recent work finding that people who suffer from depression just don't want to know. They don't want to get positive or negative news, and not getting news of any kind can aggravate depression. Okay, I want to close with a little notation, a puzzle from social media. And this is data, some of which I've been involved in acquiring, some of which comes from other researchers, about how people use social media and what happens when they get off social media. Okay, the most intriguing data is that when people are off social media for a month, because they've been paid to get off social media for a month, they will have to be paid a significant amount of money. If they are off for a month, they show higher levels of happiness, higher levels of life satisfaction, lower levels of depression, and lower levels of anxiety. So in a large population, after being off for a month, people are better off along every measure. Then they're asked after that good month, how much would you have to be paid to be off for another month? And people give a number that's almost as high as the number they gave to be off the first month. That, I say, is a puzzle. Why would people demand money to be off social media when the month that they were off social media at first made their lives better? Why would they say, you don't have to pay me anything, I'll pay you? Here it seems is the answer, that people who are off social media, while they're a little happier, a little more satisfied with their lives, a little less anxious, a little more depressed, they find the information useful. They learn about politics, they learn about friends, they learn about what's happening in the world, and they are willing to pay something to get that information, even if it makes them worse off in terms of their emotions, at least on average. That is consistent with the finding I've described, which is people are balancing, is the information useful, and is the information going to make people happy? My very ending is going to be a plea, which is when we think about information and decisions about whether to acquire it, we ought to focus a bit more than we typically do on its emotional impact. That policymakers, companies, individuals often weight the instrumental value of information and nothing else. That is doubly unfortunate. If we pay too little attention to the emotional impact of receiving information, we will make disclosure of information less effective. If it makes people feel scared or angry, it will have less impact. In addition, it's kinder, it's nicer to try to ensure that everybody's day is a little bit better than it would have otherwise been. And disclosure of information can be done in a way that tries to improve people's emotional condition during the day. If it is, that's the right thing to do. And for one reason above all, it is kind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for your very wonderful talk. I think we can start by including Dr. Nadeem's observations and a few questions he has. So I would request Dr. Nadeem to please steer the conversation further.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Fahad. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sunstein. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a wonderful talk. I appreciate it. This thing about decisions is fascinating. You've kind of found a certain heterogeneity amongst people. In fact, you have found it, not kind of. You found a heterogeneity among people who react to information. I'd like to hear your views on how, first of all, how the advertising industry already uses such information and kind of gives us information that we need and makes us buy things. How does your research impact on that or learn from that. And the second thing is that if we can identify people who, as you said, are in different categories, like more optimistic or more information seeking and things, does that alter the way we do things, especially in terms of who and how information should be provided to in terms of administration or corporate governance, or even further, going further? For example, democracy. Should we have different voting rights for people who have different approaches to information?
That's great. Thank you. And very nice to see you. So thank you for being here. With respect to advertising, I've worked at times with companies that engage in advertising, and I've noticed two things. First is there's a lot of sophistication about what advertisements increase demand. So there's some intense curiosity and real expertise that this advertisement will people to purchase more of the product, and this won't. At the same time, there's, let's say, increasing sophistication every month about what works and what doesn't, with attention to variables of the kind just discussed. So the most sophisticated companies are keenly aware that if you give people information, it may be useless if they're not convinced that the information is going to be helpful for them in their lives. And they're also alert to the fact that populations that are sad or scared by information will tend to tune it out. And some companies are more sophisticated than others than that. One clue that companies are using is if you give people information about a risk that they face, to give them simultaneously a path by which they can eliminate the risk is very effective. So if you tell people smoking is terrible, you're going to get sick, stop. That's less good than giving them specific information about what they can do to stop. And you can generalize this to people who are selling, I'm looking around my office right now, cell phones, soft drinks, books. Some advertisements say you can't afford not to buy this, which is an intuitively intelligent way of applying these ideas. For practices in democracies and companies, what I'm focusing on is if a government is disclosing information in a way that's intended to alter behavior. Let's suppose the government's benign, and it knows that some part of the population will think, I don't believe that, or I can't do anything with that, or you're just trying to scare me. And other parts of the population will think, thank you, I can now do something that will improve my economic situation or reduce safety risks. Then the government needs to think hard about how to make the. Sorry, that's my wife, USAID. She'd be very pleased that I'm talking to you all right now, but I'm not going to talk to her. The point is that to target information disclosure in a way that attends to information avoidance is really important. It's urgent for problems that involve people's mortality, that involve peace, that involves criminal behavior, etc. I don't intend to say anything about who gets to participate in politics. I'm really open to lots and lots of people getting to participate in politics.
Thank you, Cass. This is Shahid Mahmood. I'm a research fellow at Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. Thank you again for this very wonderful lecture. Just like the last two times you lectured on our webinar, and this is a fascinating subject. So I'm just going to talk a bit about it. I don't know if this is I'm not sure if this is a question or I just take it as an observation. But it reminds me of something that you must have heard of, the socialist calculation debate. That it's a very famous one between the Austrians and between the central planners. And the main dilemma over there, what the Austrians were saying was, and this was all over the information, right? So there was this, on one hand, you had the central planners who were saying that, look, there can be a benevolent central planner, and it still happens in a lot of countries. Like in Pakistan, we have a lot of centralized planning for development purposes. So what they wanted to say was, or what their basis was, that look, you can have a benevolent central planner who has very good information that the people don't have. So what they can do, use that information for development purposes to bring overall benefits to the society. And the Austrians, on the other hand, were of the view that no, nobody has perfect information. And the kind of information that the way the central planners use that information is that it might give out negative spillovers from their policies, right? So I was just wondering, listening to your fascinating talk, whether you can, what you found and what you talked about, we can apply that in terms of central planning at an aggregate level. Like most of what you talked about was at the micro level. But I was wondering, for centralized economies, centrally planned economies like Pakistan, can we what you said was, can we still apply that? And then on the other hand, there's an observation. It's kind of a question too. We witnessed what happened during the Brexit. We witnessed what happened during elections in 2020 in the US when Donald Trump was selected. And there was this dilemma that the kind of information being portrayed or being spread, a lot of it was false, but it did affect the outcomes, the final outcomes. So I'm guessing, and I would say this is my observation or my feeling, that conveying information is one thing, but on the other hand, it's also very important that you have a population that can differentiate between the negative spillovers and the positive spillovers of that information. Does the government have any role in that kind of informing people or kind of educating people in trying to separate facts from fiction? Thank you.
That's great. So I am aware of the socialist calculation debate, and Hayek is one of my heroes. So I have a lot of sympathy for the Austrian view, but let me give some specifics that are ambivalent about the Austrian view, at least as a dogma as opposed to a contribution. So if the government requires disclosure that certain foods have shrimp and peanuts in them, say, or requires disclosure that certain medicines you shouldn't take if you're on other medicines because the interaction could be bad, or you shouldn't take this medicine if you have a certain kind of heart condition, that seems to me a very good idea. And I think there's nothing in the Austrian tradition that would be inconsistent with the proposition that's a good idea. And the government knows that some people are allergic to shrimp, some people are allergic to peanuts, and that some people who have certain health conditions shouldn't take certain medicines. Now, the government can make mistakes on all of those things, but on balance, we're probably fine with that. So information disclosure, so long as it's in a government that is at least reliable-ish, that's a good idea. I'll give you a point about central planning that I'm familiar with. When I was in the White House, we required cars to be more fuel efficient over a certain period of years, ramping up. So they'd get more and more fuel efficient. And this was about the environment and climate change, and also about consumer savings. I was alert to the fact that those of us in Washington who were writing the rule would not know enough to have a 10-year plan on the fuel efficiency of automobiles. So I was very concerned that what we thought in 8 years would be the right design of automobiles in North America, that would be, for Austrian reasons, not reliable. So I was part of a group who said after 5 years, we were going to take a pause and reevaluate and see whether what we projected was too ambitious or insufficiently ambitious, and just rethink. So you can have, we might say, Austrian government that is emphatic on the importance of providing people with accurate information, using economic incentives, not setting prices, not having what Hayek most dislike, that is price controls and quantity controls, and that is humble and subject to reassessment with respect to things like, restrictions on any product that are designed to promote health and safety in the environment. Humble meaning it might turn out to be an insufficiently informed decision and that it will be revisited. So the idea of revising by reference to what's happening on the ground, that wouldn't satisfy the Austrians, I think, because they would like more humility. They wouldn't like it happened in the first place. And anything that looks like centralized planning, I think we should be cautious about. But for problems like air pollution and unsafe highways, there does need to be measured to try to protect people against the relevant risks.
Thank you. Let me have a last follow-up. I know you have to go. Very quick question. Professor Sunstein, as you know, the information overload, as you keep talking about, there's a lot of information coming out of society, perhaps far too much, at least way too much for me to keep track of. And there's a huge amount of law. And I remember your famous book, Simple, where you try to simplify the law. There's a huge amount of law, both international and local, that's coming out. And most of us citizens have to digest the currency laws, the movement laws, the various things that we need to do. And yet you're saying, yeah, people have a preference for information, but there's some information that we just have to digest. It's growing all the time. So how does that affect our first of all, our decisions and our approach to information and the decisions that we'll take from those decisions, from that information?
Okay, so I think two thoughts. One is I was talking to a public official yesterday about just this. I won't disclose the government, but someone in a government who said that the problem of information overload is so severe that to provide people with an architecture where if they don't focus on the problem, they'll be fine is a good thing. So you can take your preferred area to do something where if people don't pay attention to information, they don't worry about it, they're still going to be fine. That is often a very good idea. If you provide information to keep it as simple and clear as possible is a blessing. And we saw in connection with the pandemic, sometimes people were just deluged with information. They didn't know what to do. Some governments gave people something very simple. Can I tell you a story that is related to Pakistan and one of the many reasons I'm so grateful to get to talk to you? I'm a squash player. And when I was growing up, Pakistan had the greatest squash players in the world. They were all our heroes. Not long ago, I played squash in a doubles tournament, and I'd never played serious doubles squash. And I asked my partner right before the match, I said, tell me two things to know. Two things. I can't remember three, but tell me two things to do. And if you're a squash player, he said, I'll tell you one thing, hit the ball deep every time. Hit the ball deep every time. And I could remember that. If he told me two things, I might have struggled. This is a bit of a ridiculous example, but if the government is trying to inform or a university or the private sector, often to tell people one thing or two things is more effective than having a long list of six.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor Sunstein. Thank you very much. And please tell your wife, if she ever comes to Pakistan again, she has to pay PIDE a visit. I know she's on a 5-star tour, but still, she must at least pay us a visit. But in parting, let me also say to you, what about a country, or maybe you can react to it if you like. In our country, we are inundated with, at a schooling level, we have, and I think it's so true in many developing countries, We are trying to feed kids nationalism, religion, as well as many other things, and then the modern subjects. So how does that sit with the kids? Many of the kids maybe don't need all that information for the rest of their lives, or even value that information, but yet we thrust them on them. Does it affect their cognitive capability over a lifetime or not?
I feel I don't know enough really to answer that question, but I would say anything that gets people thinking in a way that energizes their, let's say, humanistic and arithmetic capacities is positive.
Mm-hmm.
I'll end you with one little note, shall I? In our data, the instrumental value and the emotional value of information are the prize winners. Those are what dominate people's choices. I was very light on the cognitive value, but we have data suggesting people who want information just because they want it, they're curious, those people suffer least from mental health problems.
Thank you very much, Professor Sunstein. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. We prescribed all your books here, and we are learning a lot from you. Keep up the hard work, and we shall keep following you and learning from you. And thank you very much. You're a good friend to PIDE. Thank you. All the best to you.
You.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.